I will ask Margot to introduce herself, to talk a little bit about her background, which is beautifully
Can't hear. Oh God,
narrated in this book. And it is available on Amazon if anybody wants to get a copy. And without further ado, there you go, Margot.
Okay, well, thank you. You asked me tell a little bit about myself. I was born in San Francisco and I grew up in Beverly Hills, where my mother had a Beverly Hills hotel gift shop, and I ran through the hotel like it was my playground. And I graduated from Beverly High and went to USC and UCLA and got married before I finished my degree. And we moved to Hawaii, and I finished my degree at the University of Hawaii. I was in Hawaii for 9 years. And when I came back to Berkeley and went to Berkeley to the School of Public Health. I got my doctorate in social sciences and public health, and worked for the state health department and research for many years. And after I retired, I became a video maker. And so here we are in COVID. And what are we going to do to avoid boredom? So naturally, I looked at these tapes that my mother had left. She had 6 hours of tape from a friend who had interviewed her when she was 90 years old back in 1980. And so I thought, well, this is a good project. So I listened to the tapes and I transcribed them, and and it was very complicated, but we put out this book. And my mother had a fascinating life. She grew up in Czernowitz, which at that time was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It was German speaking. They had a German university there, and she went to school there, and she was a good student. And she came from an Orthodox Jewish family in Czernowitz.
Do you want to just quickly summarize the major points in your book?
Yes, well, it talks about her life. She starts off in Czernowitz as a child, and she goes to China in 1910, and then to New York, and she met my father in Shanghai. And then they met again in New York and married in New York. And then after that, they went to Hamburg. And my father opened a import-export business in Shanghai, and they lived in Shanghai in the 1920s again. And she had a lot of adventures. Everywhere she went, she was totally impacted by the history of the time. You know, for example, in when they left China, um, they went to China with her family when she was 20 because she had a sister in China. And there was also economic factors involved. Her father was in a transportation business, and he would take a huge kegs of schnapps with his wagons and horses down from Czernowitz to Bosnia Herzegovina and sell schnapps. Well, in 1910, the Kaiser said that Jews could not sell liquor anymore. So that probably had some influence on his decision to move to China and see how his daughter was doing. So they went to China, they went to New York, after New York, they went back to Shanghai, and then there was political troubles in Shanghai, so they went to San Francisco, and they hit the political troubles in San Francisco, the Depression, and the rise of Hitler. My father had the uncanny ability to be on the losing side of every war. So he ended up going back to Germany, and my mother opened the shop in the Beverly Hills Hotel. And when she was in her 70s, she moved to Charlevoix. But she had interesting stories to tell. She was a charming person, and she attracted a lot of people. And she had a very, very interesting life, and it was fun writing about it. And I hope my grandchildren and my great grandchildren enjoy it.
What was it like for her living in Czernowitz at the beginning of the century, 20th century?
Yes, well, she was her parents were old. She was the last of 11 children, and out of the 11, six survived to adulthood. And she went to school and she was a good student. And every Saturday, the men would come over to their house and talk about the scribes and the political events, and she would be listening and serving them tea. And she was a good student, and she went to the theater a lot. She loved the theater, and she did a lot of reading. And she was a pet. She was her parents' pet, and she wore uh, clothes. I have wonderful pictures of her. You'll see it in a video shortly. I have a video to show you. But she had a privileged life in Czernowitz.
Was there a large Jewish community there?
It was about 1/3. There were about 100,000 people there, and there were probably about 25,000 Jews. Yeah.
Were they observant Jews, the family?
I think her father was. I'm not sure that the mother and the children were, but there was a range of Jewish philosophies there, as there is everywhere. And she talks about her father meeting with men that they met at the synagogue and coming to her house and talking about the scribes and the political events of the day. So it evidently was important in their life.
What led her to go to China, and what sort of life did she lead there?
Well, there was a family in Czernowitz that had a visitor come to visit them, a relative, and he met mother's sister Dora and married her, and he took her to China. And her parents were worried about her. And so when the time came that the Kaiser said Jews could not sell liquor, and they were worried about her sister Dora, so they went to China. And when she got to China, uh, she had a wonderful life. She was the only young German girl there, and she read poetry, and she was fussed over by everybody. And she met my father there, and he began courting her there in China.
Was it a large foreign community in Shanghai?
Yes, well, there was the French sector and the British section. They lived in the French section, and then where the British were there, they, of course, were in China for a long time. And there was just a small German community, though, and they were mostly merchants. My father was sent there to sell dyes to the Chinese because Germans had invented dyes, indigo, chemical indigo, and they were using vegetable indigo. So he was sent there as a part of IG Farben as a young man to sell indigo to the Chinese.
Was he involved in the wars during that period?
Oh, yes. He fought in Tsingtao. He was on the losing side in Germany fighting against Japan when there was a war in 1914 in Tsingtao. But he was clever, and he was the only one who was successful in escaping from the Japanese. And he wrote a book about it. The fact that he had torn a page out of the book listed all the prisoners that the Japanese had, and his name was on the last page because it began with W. So he escaped and walked back to Shanghai.
She went to Indonesia. Do you want to tell us about that escapade?
Oh, that was quite an escapade. He was contracted to supply arms to one of the sides opposing Mao Zedong. And so the ship was delayed. So he sent my mother to Java, to Jakarta, but now it was Batavia at the time. Now it's called Jakarta. And she went there to find out what was wrong with the ship and why it couldn't get started. And she ended up going to being entertained by the people and meeting Count Zeppelin, the son of the Zeppelin, who sent the blimp over to New York. And she had a wonderful time there. And she ended up supplying the sailors on the ship with beer and sending them out to sea so that they would get back to Shanghai with the arms. As it turned out, when the arms arrived in Shanghai, they were confiscated by one of the warlords, and they were lucky to escape with their lives. It was quite an adventure.
Quite an adventure. So when did they actually come to America?
Well, they first came to America in 1912. She was an American. Then they went back to Hamburg after World War I, and then they went back to China in 1924. And so it was all at the beginning of the 19th century.
And when they came to New York, that was in the 20s or in the 30s?
Yes. Well, no, she arrived in New York in 1912 the first time.
Uh-huh.
And that was it. But she told this story in a wonderful way. She had she was very charming, and she told her stories with a lot of vitality. And I made a little video about how she told her stories. If Vivian would like to play it now, that would be very nice. It's
That'd be great. Okay.
And so
Oh,
we'll
very
see in
good.
just a minute.
Anyway, what I tried to do is I tried to keep her voice in the book. The English isn't perfect. Her
in Czernowitz, we had a bishop in a lovely big church, and we had a beautiful temple for the Jewish people. My father must have made a very good living, and we lived in our own house. I started to go to the theater when I was 10 years old. I had an older brother who was just crazy about theater. He would have lived in it, and he never missed a show. And he took me. George was absolutely crazy. He used to take me. And then when I became 11 and 12 years, they had already groups of girls. And we all went together in a group. And we sat in the gallery for 27.5 pennies. And we saved all week our money so that we have a ticket to buy a ticket. We were 10, 20 girls. Every Sunday afternoon were classics. You know, they gave Shakespeare more in Czernowitz than they gave it in London. I had Othello, Macbeth, Hamlet, Maria Stuart, and all the Viennese operas and operettas, particularly operettas. I saw The Merry Widow when I was about maybe 13 or 14 years old. And we'd go over and over and over again, sing the same place. And then we'd come home and we'd sing the arias. And so I knew my classics. My father made a very good living. He had a transportation business. He had the wagons and the horses and the drivers. It was a very good business that he had worked up. And then he gave it up. He sold the furniture. We went to China in 1910. You see, I had a sister in China. I'll never forget that trip if I live another 100 years. It was such a beautiful trip. We went to Genoa in Italy for 3 days, you know. And we were in Algiers for 3 days because the ship needed proviant. And then we went through the Suez Canal into the Red Sea. Singapore was a really very big town, and the harbor is indescribably beautiful. So we get off, and I have read the Arabian Nights, you know, the 1001 Night. And one of the great stories is about Sinbad, the sailor man, and he had adventures in Singapore. In Singapore, when I read it, I was about 10, 11 years or 12 years old, you know. And Singapore was so far, farther than the sun, in my mind. All at once I find myself in Singapore. I couldn't believe it. In Singapore. So we traveled for 6 weeks. We left on the 20th of March, and we arrived on the 6th of May in Shanghai. I was the queen of China. When I came there, I was a sensation, because I was the only German girl there, you know. And they were taking bets, who will take me out. And my husband won the bet. I was invited to the dinner at the governor of the island of Java, when the first Dutch airplane fleet came in from Holland to Java. And there was a big palace where the governor lived. And we were all standing on the patio, and the aeroplanes were coming in. And the governor gave a big dinner party. It was unbelievable. And I was invited, you know. And we danced, and we chatted, and it was reckless. I had already my shop in the Beverly Hills Hotel. I had all the movie stars, you know, all of them. Joan Crawford would come in and sit for hours. Ingrid Bergman used to come in all the time. Greta Garbo, Leopold Stokowski, Dorothy Lamour, Betty Davis. She was a cute girl. All of them, they all came in. And Fred Astaire came down, and Charlie Chaplin came down. Walt Disney came in, and it was kind of fun. I traveled twice around the world.
You can see that she had a way of speaking and a way of telling stories that was very charming, and she had a lot of friends and was a good conversationalist. Yes.
Did you put the video together, Margot?
Yeah, I was a video maker in one of my lives, one of my other lives. But
So it seems like the next stage was their life in San Francisco. You want to tell us a little bit about that? And it was during the Depression, I think.
Yes, well, they arrived in San Francisco in 1926, and they had, my father first sold Asian arts and silks and all sorts of things to Gumps. And he says, why should I sell it to Gumps? I can have a shop myself. So he opened a shop in the Beverly Hills, in the St. Francis Hotel on the Union Square in San Francisco. And they had a very successful business. They had lingerie embroidered in China that my mother designed, and they sold it to the Junior League, who bought it for their dowries. It was a very nice business. But then all of a sudden, there was a split in the German community in the early 30s about who was pro-Hitler and who was anti-Hitler. And then their depression came in 1929. And between those two events, the shop went bankrupt. And as my mother said, when poverty comes in the window, love goes, no, when poverty comes in the door, love goes out the window. That was her saying. And they started having marital problems. And my mother packed up her things and went to Los Angeles and was hoping that she could open a business in Los Angeles where they would be successful. And in 1934, the whole family moved to Los Angeles with me and my sister and my father. And then at that point, she opened the Beverly Hills Hotel. But the shop in the St. Francis was a beautiful shop. It had a gorgeous thing. They had an upstairs section and a downstairs section with Buddhas and rugs and all sorts of beautiful things. And they ended up auctioning it off to the May Company at half price when the shop went bankrupt. But it was a very bad experience for my father. He could not find work after that, and he got he was not an American. He was a German citizen, and he remained German all his life. And he went back to Germany to support Hitler in 1936. And I don't know what how my mother's Jewishness fitted in with all that. My sister and I went to visit him in 1952 after the war. And she and I stayed with him for 2 weeks, and he showed us all around Hamburg where he was living. And after we got back, we realized we had not met one neighbor, one colleague, one friend. He did not introduce us to anybody while that he knew in Hamburg. And so it made us wonder, of course, whether he was reluctant to introduce his half Jewish American daughters to his friends, And we really don't know what his philosophy was. But as I said, he was on the losing side of every war that came through the 19th century. And anyway, my mother had a very, very good life. She had an interesting life. They were involved in history. She moved to Michigan, where my sister was living with her husband in the last 20 years of her life, but she was always interested in politics. When she was in her 70s, she wrote to Anwar Sadat to advise him about the Middle East, just because she cared, and Anwar Sadat sent her Ramadan cards. I guess getting advice from this woman living in northern Michigan in the United States. And she had a very active life, and she died in 1984 at the age of 94. And she left me these tapes. And the tapes were a gift in one sense. I was very, very grateful to the woman who interviewed her, because she did it. I had six hours of tapes, and I learned a lot about my mother and father's life that I didn't know before, on the one hand. On the other hand, he was the world's worst interviewer. She interrupted her constantly. She got her off track. She asked her leading questions. She putting the book together was a real challenge, because she would start a story on tape 1, do a middle, end it on tape 3, and put the middle part on tape 6, and getting it into a chronological order and into a readable order was a challenge. But I tried to keep her voice, even though it wasn't proper English. She had this vitality of speaking and her way of speaking, and I wanted to keep that.
So how long did it take you to put this book together?
Oh, probably about 8 months. Yeah, it was all COVID. It was a COVID activity.
The COVID book.
I was born during COVID and had to do something. Yes.
So your mother really came into her own when she was in Los Angeles and was in the Beverly Hills Hotel, right?
Yes. And she has a funny thing here. She one of the things that she comments is after she was divorced, she could not adjust to the American men. I was thoroughly German. The war was going on. There was not one man who appealed to me, but in the Second World War, there was a man who appealed to me. One man, Leopold Stokowski. Then Greta Garbo came along and took him away. So, she had a way of writing in a way. Yeah. So she had a way of writing that was very entertaining, and she had an interesting life, and she had an interesting way of looking at things.
So your early growing up years were in Los Angeles when she was running the store. Did you spend a lot of time in the store?
Oh, yes, I spent a lot of time in the store. I particularly liked the comic books. She had comic books there that came in every month, and I would get a chance to read all the new comic books that came in the door. And then there were parts of the hotel that were fascinating. Like Liz Taylor's father Howard Taylor had an art gallery in the downstairs gallery that was fabulous. And at that time, the hotel upholstered its own furniture to repair it. And they had an upholstery shop, and the women in the upholstery shop were very nice to this little kid. And they would allow me to watch them make upholstery. I've always known how to upholster as a result. And one time on the balcony, Vali Wieseltier, who was this artist from Vienna, was there, and she sculpted a hippopotamus in a tutu lying on a chaise lounge. And she sent it to Walt Disney, and he included it in Fantasia. And I could see the sculpture that she made, and she talked to me and gave me cookies. So it was an adventure being there.
So we have about 3 minutes left. Anybody have a question? There's one question. Did your father actually fight in World War II on the German side?
No, he was drafted into the German army when he was 60 years old during World War II, and he worked in communications. He spoke French and English and Chinese, and uh, he was not on the front lines. He had an adventure going from where he was discharged back to Berlin, where he was living, and he was in Berlin during the Berlin airlift, and wrote letters there too.
Hmm.
So you know, he was already in his 70s during World War II. But when we went to Hamburg to visit him, we never saw any men. The men were gone. It was really sad. We only saw men who were under the age of 15 and over the age of 80.
Mm-hmm.
There was a question about the firebombing of Hamburg. Did you see that at all?
Oh, yes. When we went to Hamburg to visit him in 1952, there was rubble everywhere. Everywhere. There were blocks full of rubble. And it was quite a sight, you know.
All right, we're out of time. So I want to thank everybody, especially Margot. A lovely presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank
That
you
was
for having
great.
me. It's been a delight putting this together. Thank you so much.
And thank you all for coming. This was a wonderful session.